Most people spend their entire lives monitoring the opinions of others. They watch reactions, they read between the lines, they adjust their behavior, their voice, their desires, all in an endless attempt to be accepted, approved, validated. And then there is a much smaller group, a minority so rare that when you meet one of them, you feel it immediately. They are not obsessed with what others think. They are obsessed with understanding themselves. That single difference changes everything. If you are listening to this right now, there is a strong chance you have reached a quiet but irreversible moment in your life. The moment when you realize that living for everyone else has slowly cost you your connection to yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, silently. You didn't lose yourself in chaos. You lost yourself in adaptation. At some point, you learned who you were supposed to be, what was expected of you, what was rewarded, what was tolerated, and little by little, without ever making a conscious decision, you began to orbit around other people's expectations instead of your own inner gravity. Here is the truth most people never confront. A life built around external approval will never feel like it belongs to you. You may succeed, you may be praised, you may be admired, and still feel strangely hollow. Because success without self-knowledge feels like wearing someone else's clothes, impressive from the outside, uncomfortable on the inside. Now, let me ask you something uncomfortable but necessary. When was the last time you truly reflected on yourself? Not your problems, not your responsibilities, not your failures or to-do lists, but you, who you actually are beneath the roles. What you genuinely want. Not what sounds reasonable, not what looks respectable, but what feels undeniably true when no one is watching. Most people cannot answer that question, not because they are unintelligent, but because they have been trained away from themselves. From an early age, we are taught to measure our worth through comparison, grades, performance, social approval, visibility. Slowly, the inner world becomes less important than the external scoreboard, and that is where the real damage begins. Because when you stop paying attention to your inner life, you begin living a life that feels strangely misaligned, a life filled with movement but no meaning, jobs that drain you but pay the bills, relationships that feel familiar but not nourishing. Days that blur together into a kind of emotional maintenance mode. You are alive, but not fully inhabiting your own existence. And here is the paradox most people never see. The more you live for others, the more invisible you feel. Not to them, to yourself. But today that pattern can end, not by becoming selfish, not by rejecting the world, but by developing a very specific kind of obsession, an obsession with self-understanding, not narcissism, not ego inflation, but radical, inner honesty. There was a moment in my own life when this truth stopped being philosophical and became unavoidable. I was in my early 30s, sitting alone in a small apartment, surrounded by the quiet evidence of failure, plans that didn't work. Dreams that dissolved, years spent following advice from people who had never lived the life I wanted. I had done everything right. I had listened, adapted, compromised, and yet nothing felt like mine. That night, I asked myself a question so simple and so dangerous that it shattered the structure of my life. If I did not need to impress anyone, not my family, not society, not even my past self, what would I actually do? The silence that followed was terrifying. There was no answer. Not because the answer didn't exist, but because I had been disconnected from myself for so long that I no longer knew how to listen. That realization changed everything. I understood something most people never allow themselves to see. You cannot build a meaningful life without first knowing the person who is supposed to live it. That night, I made a decision that would quietly rewire my entire existence. I would become a student of my own inner world. I would observe my patterns the way a scientist studies nature. I would question my fears instead of obeying them. I would examine my desires without immediately censoring them, not to judge myself, but to understand. That decision did not make life easier overnight, but it made life real. Clarity replaced confusion. Direction replaced constant second-guessing, and for the first time, my actions began to feel aligned with something deeper than approval. Here is what I discovered through years of inner work. Every individual who reaches true greatness, not superficial success, but inner authority, shares one trait. They are not reactive to the world. They are rooted in themselves. They know who they are. They know what they stand for. And because of that, the opinions of others lose their hypnotic power, not because they don't care, but because they care about something deeper. This is what conscious self-obsession really means. It means studying your inner landscape with courage. It means asking questions most people avoid. It means noticing when you are living from fear instead of truth. And here is the secret no one tells you. The more deeply you understand yourself, the more powerfully you can serve the world. Because authenticity is magnetic, clarity is stabilizing, and a person who knows themselves stops unconsciously asking others for permission to exist. This is not about isolation. It is about alignment. In the next block, we will go deeper into why most people are psychologically addicted to external validation, how that addiction forms, and how breaking it feels uncomfortable at first, but ultimately liberating. Because the moment you stop asking, "Who should I be for others?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming?" your entire life begins to reorganize itself around that answer. Let's clear something up immediately. Being obsessed with yourself does not mean being narcissistic. It does not mean being self-centered, emotionally blind, or disconnected from others. In fact, the opposite is true. A person who does not know themselves deeply will always unconsciously use others to fill their inner void. True self-obsession is not about inflating the ego. It is about refining the instrument through which life expresses itself. Think about it this way. If you were a surgeon, would it be selfish to master your craft? If you were a musician, would it be ego to practice relentlessly? If you were a healer, would it be arrogance to deepen your ability to heal? Of course not. It would be your responsibility. In the same way, it is not egoistic to evolve into the most complete version of yourself. It is a moral obligation. Because the world does not need your exhaustion. It does not need your self-betrayal. It does not need your half-lived potential. It needs the clearest, strongest, most integrated expression of who you are. When you truly understand yourself, abundance does not come from chasing. It emerges naturally. Because fullness attracts, clarity attracts, inner coherence attracts. When I speak of conscious self-obsession, I am referring to the deliberate cultivation of 4 essential dimensions that most people neglect entirely. Not out of laziness, but out of conditioning. These 4 dimensions are not separate. They are interdependent layers of one system. Your conscious mind, your emotional depth, your spiritual orientation, your physical vitality. When these 4 evolve together, something rare happens. You stop leaking energy. Your life stops feeling fragmented. Your decisions stop feeling forced, and your presence gains weight. Let's begin with the conscious mind. Most people treat their minds like open public spaces. They allow random thoughts to wander in. They absorb opinions without questioning them. They consume mental noise endlessly and then wonder why they feel anxious, distracted, and directionless. But those who master life treat the mind as sacred territory. They curate it. They train it. They protect it. Every single morning before exposing their mind to the external world, they make a conscious deposit. They read something that expands perspective. They listen to something that sharpens clarity. They reflect on what actually matters. This is not a habit. It is an act of self-respect. Now notice how most people begin their day. They wake up and immediately reach for their phone. They scroll. They consume headlines. They absorb other people's emotions, fears, and priorities before their own consciousness is even awake. Within minutes, their inner world is no longer theirs. And then they ask, genuinely confused, why do I feel overwhelmed? Why can't I focus? Why do I feel disconnected from myself? Because they surrendered the steering wheel before the engine even started. A healthy obsession with yourself means you decide what enters your mind. You choose the ideas you entertain. You choose the voices you listen to. You choose the images you expose yourself to, because your mind is the soil from which your entire life grows. I once met a man who was completely depleted. He told me, "I feel like my life doesn't belong to me. Every day is spent responding to other people's needs, other people's problems, other people's priorities. By the end of the day, there is nothing left for me." So I asked him a question that stopped him cold. "How much time do you spend thinking about your own life?" He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "How many minutes a day," I asked, "do you consciously reflect on your own direction, your own desires, your own long-term vision?" There was a long silence. Finally, he admitted the truth. Almost none. That silence was the real diagnosis. Because a life lived entirely in reaction will always feel exhausting. You are not tired because you are weak. You are tired because your energy is being spent everywhere except where it belongs. Self-obsession, in its healthiest form, means reclaiming that energy. It means asking questions most people avoid. What am I actually building? What patterns keep repeating in my life? Where am I betraying myself for comfort or approval? What parts of me have I neglected because they didn't fit expectations? This is not indulgent introspection. It is strategic awareness. Now let's talk about emotional depth. Most people were never taught how to sit with their emotions. They were taught how to suppress them, distract from them, intellectualize them. But emotions do not disappear when ignored. They go underground. And what lives underground eventually controls behavior. People who are not emotionally self-aware are reactive. They overcompensate. They seek validation. They repeat the same relational patterns without understanding why. Conscious obsession with yourself means learning your emotional language, knowing what triggers you, knowing what drains you, knowing what genuinely nourishes you. It means developing the capacity to feel without being ruled by feeling. And from that emotional clarity emerges something rare, emotional authority. You no longer depend on others to regulate your inner state. You no longer outsource your worth. Then comes spiritual orientation. Not religion, not belief systems, but orientation. A sense that your life is part of something larger than momentary gratification. People without spiritual orientation drift. They chase stimulation. They confuse pleasure with meaning. But those who cultivate inner alignment begin to move with intention. They ask, what kind of human being am I becoming through my choices? What values am I embodying daily, not in words, but in action? Finally, there is physical evolution. The body is not separate from the mind. It is the container of your consciousness. Neglect the body and clarity fades. Energy drops, discipline weakens. Those who respect themselves physically are not obsessed with appearance. They are obsessed with vitality. Because a strong body supports a focused mind, emotional resilience, and spiritual steadiness. When these four dimensions evolve together, something profound happens. You stop chasing purpose. You stop begging for validation. You stop waiting for permission. You begin to move from inner authority. And from that place, your life stops feeling like a series of obligations and starts feeling like an expression. In the next block, we will explore why most people resist this process, why self-understanding feels threatening to the ego, and why staying disconnected from yourself often feels safer. even when it is slowly destroying you. Because the real question is no longer, how do I improve my life? It is, am I willing to truly know the person who is living it? At that moment he finally admitted the truth. None. Not minutes, not hours, none. That was the real problem. For years he had been consumed by other people's expectations, meeting demands, managing appearances, fulfilling roles, until he had completely lost contact with himself. He didn't lack discipline, he didn't lack intelligence, he lacked inner orientation. So we created what I call sacred self-reflection time. Not productivity time, not problem-solving time, but protected moments dedicated solely to contemplating his own growth, his values, his direction. No distractions, no external input, just presence with himself. The results were remarkable. Within months, his energy returned. But more importantly, something deeper emerged: inner clarity. His decisions became simpler, his relationships shifted, his work gained meaning, because when you consciously turn toward yourself, you don't become smaller. You become full, and fullness has far more to give than depletion ever could. This brings us to the second, essential dimension: emotional development. Most people live inside their emotions without ever understanding them. They react automatically. They are pulled by moods. They let external events dictate their internal state. They say things like, I don't know why I feel anxious. I don't know why I'm irritated. I don't know why I feel empty. But here is a truth most people were never taught. Your emotions are not something that simply happen to you. They are something you generate. Every emotional state is created by the meaning you assign to what happens around you. Change the meaning, consciously, and the emotion changes with it. A healthy obsession with yourself means taking full responsibility for your emotional world. Not suppressing emotions, not judging them, but studying them. I once worked with a woman in her 40s who said something unforgettable. I'm realizing for the first time in my life that I was never taught how to manage my emotions. I just endure them. She wasn't weak, she wasn't broken, she was untrained. So I told her something I want you to remember. Your emotions are feedback, not commands. They are signals, not sentences. When you learn to observe them with curiosity instead of fear, everything changes. A conscious self-obsession treats emotions the way a scientist treats a complex system, with precision, with honesty, without judgment. You begin to ask better questions. What situations consistently trigger me? What thoughts appear right before anxiety arises? What stories am I telling myself in moments of frustration? What interpretations drain my energy and which restore it? This is where transformation truly begins. Because when you understand your emotional patterns, you stop being possessed by them. You become the observer and eventually the architect. Over time, I developed what I call an emotional toolkit. Not affirmations, not denial, but deliberate internal strategies that allow me to shift my state consciously. For example, when frustration arises, I immediately ask myself, what is this situation here to teach me? How is this shaping me? What strength is being forged right now? That single question changes everything. It moves me from victimhood to learning, from resistance to curiosity, from contraction to growth. And here's something worth reflecting on deeply. Most people spend more time learning how to use a phone than learning how to regulate their inner world. They read manuals for appliances, they watch tutorials for software, but they never study the mechanics of their own mind and heart. Then they wonder why they feel emotionally out of control. A healthy obsession with yourself means becoming an expert in your own emotional mechanics. It means noticing how your body reacts, how your thoughts influence feeling, how certain interpretations drain you while others empower you. It means no longer outsourcing your inner state to circumstances. And this emotional mastery is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming stable, From that stability, compassion becomes natural, boundaries become clear, presence becomes powerful. In the next block, we will move deeper into spiritual orientation and physical embodiment, and why without these dimensions, even emotional intelligence collapses under pressure. Because self-obsession, when done correctly, is not indulgence. It is integration. And integration is the foundation of a life that finally feels like your own. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to what others say, reacting to circumstances, reacting to emotions they never chose and never learned to understand. And then they wonder why life feels unstable, exhausting, out of their control. Here is the uncomfortable truth very few are willing to face. You are not controlled by events. You are controlled by your emotional interpretations of those events. Until you master that, no amount of intelligence, discipline, or ambition will set you free. This is where real self-obsession begins, not in admiration, not in ego, but in emotional responsibility. Carl Jung understood something most people avoid their entire lives. The inner world governs the outer one. If your emotions rule you unconsciously, your life will reflect chaos. If you learn to observe and shape them consciously, your life begins to align. But here is where most people misunderstand emotions. They believe emotions happen to them. That anger, anxiety, frustration, sadness arrive uninvited like storms. They don't. Every emotion is a response to meaning, not to reality, but to the story you tell yourself about reality. Two people can live the same experience. One grows stronger, the other collapses. The difference is not strength, it is interpretation. This is why emotional mastery is not suppression, denial, or positivity. It is awareness. Healthy self-obsession means becoming a student of your own emotional mechanics. Not judging them, not fighting them, not dramatizing them, observing them like a scientist studies a system. Ask yourself this honestly. What situations consistently drain you? What thoughts immediately precede your anxiety? What internal narratives turn minor obstacles into emotional weight? Most people never ask these questions. They distract themselves. They numb themselves. They normalize emotional chaos. And then they live lives dictated by moods they never chose. Jung warned that what remains, unconscious, does not disappear. It governs from below. Your emotional world, when ignored, becomes your invisible ruler. This is why emotionally mature individuals appear calm, grounded, and decisive. Not because they lack emotion, but because they understand it. They do not ask, "Why do I feel this way?" They ask, "What meaning am I assigning right now?" That shift changes everything. Let me give you a practical insight that changed my own life. I realized that frustration, for me, always appeared when reality did not match expectation. Not because something was wrong, but because I was attached to an outcome. The moment I replaced the question, "Why is this happening to me?" with, "What is this trying to teach me?" my emotional state changed instantly. Same situation, same reality, different meaning, and therefore different emotion. This is not optimism. This is emotional intelligence. Self-obsession, at this level, means building an inner toolkit. Deliberate strategies you use when emotional turbulence appears, not to escape it, but to transform it. For anxiety, you might ask, "What future am I imagining that doesn't exist yet?" For anger, "What boundary feels violated, and why haven't I honored it?" For sadness, "What attachment am I being asked to release?" These questions return authority to you. They shift you from victim to observer, from reaction to authorship. And here is something most people never realize. Emotional mastery does not make you colder. It makes you deeper. When emotions stop controlling you, they become information instead of threats. You feel more, but you suffer less. Now we must move into something even more essential: Emotional mastery without spiritual clarity creates intelligent but empty individuals. People who know how to manage themselves but don't know why they exist. This is where many successful people collapse inwardly. They achieve what society praises, yet feel strangely disconnected from meaning. Jung saw this repeatedly in his work. People who climbed high externally while remaining fragmented internally. They were productive, but not fulfilled, capable, but not aligned. This is why the next layer of conscious self-obsession is spiritual growth. And no, this is not about religion. It is about connection to something larger than immediate gratification, fear, or survival. Ask yourself, what do you serve beyond comfort? What values guide your decisions when no one is watching? What kind of human being are you becoming? Most people never slow down long enough to ask. They chase goals inherited from culture, family, or comparison, and then wonder why success feels hollow. Spiritual clarity means revisiting these questions constantly, not once. Your purpose is not a static answer. It evolves as you evolve. When your inner values are clear, decision-making becomes simple. You stop forcing paths that don't belong to you. You stop betraying yourself for approval. You stop confusing movement with progress. Every aligned life you admire has this in common. Inner clarity precedes outer order. This is what Block 4 establishes. You cannot build the future version of yourself without emotional sovereignty and spiritual orientation. In the next block, everything shifts again. We move from inner alignment to embodiment, from understanding to action, from clarity to discipline, from internal order to lived expression, because insight without embodiment becomes another form of avoidance. And that is where most people get stuck. There comes a moment in every serious path of self-mastery where understanding is no longer enough. You can clarify your thoughts. You can regulate your emotions. You can even discover a sense of purpose. But if your body remains neglected, fragmented, or depleted, everything else eventually collapses under its own weight. This is where many people unconsciously stop evolving, not because they lack knowledge, but because they disconnect the body from the self. They tell themselves a convenient lie. That's superficial. That's vanity. That doesn't really matter. But the truth is far more confronting. Your body is not an accessory to your life. It is the instrument through which life is experienced. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every insight you reach, every spiritual realization you touch, all of it passes through the body first. A neglected body cannot sustain a liberated mind. Physical energy is not separate from mental clarity or emotional stability. It is the foundation beneath them. When the body is weak, overstimulated, inflamed, or exhausted, the mind becomes noisy. Emotions become reactive. Spiritual connection becomes abstract instead of lived. This is not philosophy, it is physiology. True self-commitment demands embodiment. To be fully committed to yourself means treating your physical health not as an aesthetic project, but as a moral responsibility. Because when your body functions optimally, everything else aligns more easily. Focus sharpens, emotional resilience increases, presence deepens, discipline becomes natural rather than forced. This is why those who take their physical vitality seriously often appear grounded in a way others can't explain. They move differently. They think differently. They respond rather than react. Not because they are superior, but because their system is regulated. A regulated nervous system changes your entire relationship with life. And here is where self-commitment becomes visible. You cannot fake physical integrity. You can speak beautifully about growth, consciousness, and purpose, but your daily habits reveal the truth. How you eat, how you move, how you sleep, how you recover. These are not minor details. They are daily votes for the version of yourself you are becoming. Treating your body with respect is not narcissism. It is coherence. It means your inner values are expressed externally. When you nourish your body, intentionally, you are telling your unconscious mind, I matter, my energy matters, my life matters. That message compounds. Over time, it becomes identity, and identity determines behavior. But let's speak honestly about the resistance that appears at this stage, because the moment you begin prioritizing your body, your time, your routines, your boundaries, the world responds, not always kindly. Some people benefited from your exhaustion, some grew comfortable with your availability, some preferred the version of you that said yes while silently resenting it. When you begin saying no to what drains you and yes to what sustains you, you disrupt invisible contracts. And disruption creates friction. You may be told you are selfish, too rigid, too focused on yourself, too unavailable. But what is actually happening is simpler. You are no longer abandoning yourself for approval, and that makes people uncomfortable, because your self-respect highlights their self-neglect. Here is a principle few understand. Every serious transformation creates social tension before it creates social respect. At first, people resist your boundaries. Later, they adjust. Eventually, they redefine how they treat you, or they leave. Both outcomes are forms of alignment. Self-commitment demands courage, not just internally, but relationally. It asks you to tolerate misunderstanding without collapsing back into old patterns, to stay anchored in your values, even when external validation disappears. This is why physical discipline is such a powerful teacher. It trains you to act according to principle, not mood, according to long-term integrity, not short-term comfort. When you choose to move your body despite resistance, to nourish it despite convenience, to rest it despite pressure, you are rehearsing a deeper truth. I lead myself. And leadership always begins internally. Now notice what is happening across the block so far. First, awareness, then emotional mastery, then spiritual clarity. Now embodiment. This is not accidental. Growth that skips the body becomes unstable. Growth that includes the body becomes sustainable. The body grounds insight into reality. Without it, self-development remains theoretical. With it, transformation becomes lived. In the next block, everything converges. Because once mind, emotion, spirit, and body begin aligning, a new challenge emerges: integration under pressure. How do you maintain self-commitment when life intensifies? When fear appears, when uncertainty rises, when old identities attempt to reclaim control? That is where most people relapse. One of the most predictable moments in any genuine transformation is resistance, not from strangers, not from critics online, but from the people closest to you, and from the quiet, conditioned voice inside your own mind. When you begin to invest in yourself seriously, your time, your energy, your inner development, a question inevitably appears. Isn't there something more important you should be doing? Don't other people need you? Isn't this a bit selfish? On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even caring. But underneath it lies a misunderstanding that has trapped millions of people in quiet exhaustion. Here is the truth few are willing to articulate. When you become deeply committed to your own growth, you do not become less available to life. You become more capable of meeting it. Self-commitment does not shrink your capacity to give, it expands it. But expansion always threatens systems built on depletion. Many relationships unconsciously rely on you staying tired, scattered, and overextended. Your availability was never neutral. It served a role. When you begin reclaiming yourself, that role dissolves. And systems resist dissolution. This resistance often appears wrapped in moral language. Good people put others first. Strong people don't need so much attention. Love means sacrifice. But sacrifice without replenishment does not create love. It creates resentment. Resentment is not a character flaw, it is a signal that you have been giving from an empty place for too long. And here is the paradox. The people who give the most sustainably are not the ones who abandon themselves. They are the ones who are deeply resourced internally. Think of the oxygen mask metaphor, not as a cliché, but as a psychological law. If you are not breathing, you cannot help anyone else breathe. If your nervous system is constantly dysregulated, you transmit that instability to everyone around you, especially those you love most. Children do not learn self-worth from lectures. They learn it from observation. They watch how you treat yourself, how you respect your limits, how you recover, how you rest. Neglect teaches neglect. Martyrdom teaches self-erasure. And self-erasure is not virtue. It is a survival strategy mistaken for morality. Many people who pride themselves on always being there for others are secretly angry at the very people they claim to serve. That anger has a source. It comes from the unconscious realization that no one ever taught them they were allowed to matter too. But here is the uncomfortable truth. No one will give you permission to prioritize yourself. You must take it, and when you do, your conditioned mind will protest, because it was trained in an environment where love was conditional, where approval was earned through usefulness, where rest felt dangerous. So when you choose yourself, the old programming panics. It tells you that you are becoming cold, self-centered, unavailable. But what is actually happening is integration. You are no longer fragmenting yourself to meet external expectations. You are becoming whole. Carl Jung observed that wholeness always appears threatening to fragmented systems because a whole person cannot be easily controlled through guilt. And guilt is one of the most powerful levers in human psychology. Many people unconsciously use guilt to maintain proximity, relevance, and power in relationships, not out of malice, but out of fear. When you stop responding to guilt, dynamics shift. Some relationships deepen, others dissolve. Both outcomes are forms of truth. Let me share an example that illustrates this clearly. A woman in her late 40s came to me completely depleted. A single mother, endlessly responsible, endlessly available. She said, "I don't have the luxury of focusing on myself. My children need me." I asked her a question that initially felt confronting, but necessary. What are you teaching them about how a human being should live inside their own life? Silence followed. She realized that her self-neglect was not noble. It was instructive. She was teaching her children that exhaustion is normal, that boundaries are optional, that self-erasure is love. And she asked herself a question that changed everything. If my children lived exactly the way I live now, would I feel proud of the example I gave? Hear them? That was the turning point, because self-commitment is not indulgence, it is leadership. When you take responsibility for your own well-being, you model something radical, a human being who honors their inner life. And that model is more powerful than any advice you will ever give. But let's be clear, the resistance does not disappear overnight. Your mind will attempt to negotiate. Just a little less time for yourself. Just one more sacrifice. Just delay your needs again. This is the final echo of an identity built on depletion. And this is where discipline takes a new form. Not discipline as force, but discipline as fidelity. Fidelity to your values, fidelity to your energy, fidelity to the version of yourself you are becoming. Because once you cross this threshold, there is no going back without cost. You will feel the difference between a life lived from fullness and a life lived from obligation. And obligation will begin to feel intolerable, not because you stopped caring, but because you started respecting yourself. In the next block, we address the most dangerous moment in transformation, when clarity exists, but fear attempts to reclaim control, because growth is not linear, and the psyche has one final test before integration stabilizes. There is a moment in every genuine transformation when intention must become structure. Insight alone is not enough. Awareness without embodiment fades. If self-commitment is not anchored into daily life, it remains an idea, not an identity. This is where most people fail. They feel inspired, awakened, even motivated, but their lives remain architecturally unchanged, and the psyche does not respond to promises. It responds to patterns. Real self-devotion is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and uncompromising. Let me return to the woman we spoke about earlier, the mother who had spent decades sacrificing herself to the point of exhaustion. Her breakthrough did not come from a radical escape or a complete reinvention of her life. It came from something far more powerful, non-negotiable space. We began with something small but sacred. 30 minutes every morning before the children woke up. Time that belonged to her alone. 1 hour every Sunday, devoted to something that nourished her inner life. 2 evenings a week reserved for movement, learning, or silence. No justifications, no guilt, no explanations. At first, her nervous system resisted. She felt restless, uncomfortable, almost anxious. This reaction was not a flaw. It was conditioning. Her psyche had been trained to equate worth with usefulness, value with availability. Stillness felt unsafe, but she stayed with it. And slowly, something remarkable occurred. She became more patient, not because she tried harder, but because she was no longer depleted. More present, not because she focused more, but because she was no longer fragmented. More alive, not because her circumstances changed, but because her relationship with herself did. And something unexpected happened. Her children began responding to her differently. They did not rebel against her boundaries. They respected them. They felt the shift. Children are exquisitely sensitive to integrity. They sensed that their mother now existed from a place of inner authority rather than quiet resentment. By honoring herself, she had unknowingly given them permission to do the same. This is the paradox few understand. Self-devotion does not weaken your relationships. It stabilizes them, but only if it is built into the structure of your life, which brings us to the first essential practice, the sacred hour. Every person who has achieved psychological integration has some form of this ritual. A daily period of time, ideally at the same hour, that is devoted exclusively to your inner development. This is not work time, not family time, not obligation time. It is soul time. During this hour, you do not produce for others. You cultivate yourself. You may read something that expands your mind, meditate to deepen your awareness, move your body to restore vitality, reflect on your direction, values, and inner state. The content matters less than the consistency, because consistency rewires identity. When I began this practice decades ago, I chose the early morning. I woke 1 hour earlier than necessary, not because I had extra energy, but because I needed to reclaim authorship over my own mind. At first, everything resisted. My body wanted comfort. My mind listed urgent tasks. My conditioning whispered guilt, but I persisted. And that single hour became the gravitational center of my entire life. It was where clarity was renewed, where intention was sharpened, where alignment was restored, and from that hour everything else organized itself more easily. You do not need to begin with an hour. Begin with 15 minutes or 20. What matters is not duration, but declaration. You are declaring to yourself, my inner life matters. My evolution is not optional. I am worthy of my own attention. And the psyche listens. The second essential practice is what I call the weekly audit of alignment. Once a week, you pause and examine your life with honesty, not judgment. You ask questions most people avoid. Where did my energy go this week? Did my time reflect my values or my fears? How much of my life was lived reactively rather than intentionally? Carl Jung taught that individuation demands radical honesty, not cruelty toward oneself, but clarity. This reflection is not about shame, it is about awakening, because once you see your patterns clearly, you cannot unsee them, and unconscious living becomes increasingly uncomfortable. This discomfort is not punishment, it is growth. Each week, you reclaim small fragments of your life, one boundary at a time, one decision at a time, one conscious no, followed by a meaningful yes. Over time, these fragments reassemble into something powerful, a life that feels like it belongs to you. And this leads to the third practice, perhaps the most difficult: energetic discernment. Not everything that demands your time deserves your energy. Many people are exhausted not because they are doing too much, but because they are doing too much of what does not align. Every commitment carries an energetic cost. You must begin asking, does this nourish me or drain me? Does this expand me or contract me? Does this serve my evolution or maintain an old identity? This does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means engaging with life consciously rather than compulsively. As Jung observed, when the psyche moves toward wholeness, it naturally sheds what no longer belongs, not through force, through clarity, and clarity creates boundaries without aggression. As you implement these practices, resistance will arise again, from others, from within. This is not failure, it is confirmation, because your life is reorganizing around a new center. In the next block, we will address the most subtle challenge of all. What happens when your outer life begins to change, but your inner identity lags behind? This is where many people self-sabotage, and this is where integration must deepen. At a certain point on the path of self-devotion, a subtle but decisive shift must occur. You stop measuring your life by how much you give, and begin measuring it by where you give from. Not from obligation, not from fear of disappointing others, but from integrity. This is the stage where many people hesitate because it requires something most were never taught: loving boundaries. Carl Jung understood that individuation is not achieved by endless accommodation. It is achieved through discernment. Every time you say yes, you are shaping your life. Every time you say no, you are shaping it as well. The tragedy is that most people never realize this. They drift through years on psychological autopilot, repeating the same habits, answering the same demands, living inside routines that slowly numb the soul, without ever asking the most important question: is the life I am living actually leading me toward who I am meant to become? This is why weekly self-reflection is not optional. It is essential. When you pause and honestly review how you are spending your time, energy, and attention, patterns reveal themselves. Perhaps you notice how much time you have poured into distractions that promise connection but deliver emptiness. Perhaps you see how often you said yes out of politeness while quietly betraying your own needs. Perhaps you recognize that entire portions of your life are organized around expectations that no longer belong to you. These realizations are not meant to shame you. They are meant to wake you up. Awareness returns authorship. I personally engage in this reflection every Sunday evening. I review the week not with criticism, but with curiosity. What energized me? What drained me? Where did I act from alignment? And where did I act from habit or fear? Then I design the coming week not around urgency, but around intention. This ritual has saved me from a life dictated by external demands. It anchors me in what matters, and from that anchoring, boundaries naturally emerge. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They do not reject others, they protect your becoming. One of Jung's most powerful insights was this: every time you say yes to something that contradicts your values, you unconsciously say no to your individuation. Read that again. This truth transformed the way I relate to commitment. Before accepting any new responsibility, I now ask myself, Does this move me closer to my essence or further away? Does this use my natural gifts or require me to betray them? Does this expand my life or quietly diminish it? Not every responsibility is optional, of course, but within the realm of choice, selectivity is not selfish, it is wisdom. When you stop offering your energy indiscriminately, something remarkable happens. Your contributions become cleaner, your presence becomes stronger, your yes becomes meaningful. People may initially resist this version of you. Those who benefited from your overgiving may feel uncomfortable. Those accustomed to your availability may interpret boundaries as distance. This is not cruelty, this is growth. Jung reminded us that psychological maturation often disrupts existing relational dynamics. Not because you have changed into something worse, but because you have stopped abandoning yourself. And here is the paradox few understand. When you stop giving from depletion, you actually become more valuable to others. Not because you do more, but because what you give now carries truth. Energy given from integrity nourishes. Energy given from resentment poisons. Many people believe that saying no will shrink their world. In reality, it refines it. Each boundary clarifies your identity. Each conscious commitment becomes a declaration of who you are becoming. Imagine treating your life as a sacred project. Every invitation, obligation, and relationship evaluated through a single lens. Does this belong to the person I am becoming? Not to the person you were conditioned to be. Not to the version shaped by fear or expectation, but to the self emerging now. This level of intentionality is not rigid, it is alive. It allows you to engage deeply without losing yourself, to love fully without self-erasure, to serve generously without resentment. And this is where something profound begins to happen. As your outer life becomes more aligned, your inner world shifts. Old identities begin to loosen. Outdated self-concepts start to dissolve. And this brings us to a critical threshold, because when your external behavior changes faster than your internal self-image, tension arises. You may feel unfamiliar with your own clarity, uncomfortable with your own boundaries, guilty for honoring yourself. This is not regression. This is the psyche reorganizing. In the next block, we will explore what happens when your life starts reflecting your growth, but your identity has not fully caught up. This is where many people unconsciously sabotage themselves, and this is where integration must go deeper. At some point, self-devotion stops being an idea and becomes an investment. Not an investment in productivity, not an investment in image, but an investment in the life you are meant to live. Let me share one of the most transformative experiences I have ever witnessed. A man in his mid-50s came to me completely disoriented. He said, "I've spent my entire adult life trying to be what everyone needed me to be, the son my parents expected, the husband my wife relied on, the employee my boss respected, but I have never once asked who I am." There was no drama in his voice, only exhaustion. I looked at him and said something simple but destabilizing. "Then that's where we begin." I asked him a question that many people go their entire lives avoiding. If you could design your life from zero, free from expectations, fear, and borrowed identities, what would it look like? At first, he couldn't answer. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had been disconnected from his essence for so long that his authentic preferences were buried under decades of compliance. So I gave him a different task. For 1 week, I asked him to observe, not to change anything, not to fix his life, just to notice. Notice when he felt alive, notice when he felt drained, notice which actions came from truth and which came from obligation. At first, the observations were subtle, then they became undeniable. He rediscovered his love for photography. something he had abandoned in his 20s because it was impractical. He noticed that deep, meaningful conversations energized him, while surface-level interactions left him hollow. He realized that creativity and autonomy were not hobbies for him. They were core values. And his career offered neither. The transformation was not dramatic, it was precise. He began taking small, consistent steps, picking up the camera again, seeking genuine connection, restructuring his work to reflect more of his creative spirit. But the most important change wasn't external, it was internal. For the first time, his choices were being guided by his values, not borrowed expectations. 2 years later, he sent me a photograph. He looked almost unrecognizable, not because his appearance had changed, but because his energy had. There was a spark in his eyes that had been absent for decades. He wrote, "For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm living my life, not performing a role in someone else's story." This is the power of constructive self-obsession, not narcissism, not self-absorption, but self-realization. It is the process Jung described when he spoke of centering the ego around the true self, the organizing principle that brings wholeness to life. When you align with who you actually are, you stop merely existing. You begin to live with direction, with coherence, with meaning. And now, as we approach the end of this reflection, I want to leave you with both a challenge and a promise. The challenge is simple, but not easy. Begin today, not tomorrow, not next week, not when life slows down. Today. Dedicate at least 15 minutes to your own evolution. Read something that nourishes your mind. Do something that strengthens your body. Reflect on something that feeds your soul. 15 minutes, but done consciously. This is not about adding another task to your schedule. It is about reclaiming authorship. And here is the promise. If you commit to cultivating this form of constructive self-obsession daily, patiently, without drama, your life will change in ways that cannot be faked or forced. You will begin to feel more aligned, more energized, more yourself. Decisions will become clearer, relationships more honest, opportunities more resonant, not because the world suddenly changes, but because you do. And when you change who you are internally, the life you experience externally reorganizes around that truth. In the final block, we will close this journey, not with motivation, not with pressure, but with integration. We will speak about what it means to live as someone who is no longer fragmented, someone who is no longer chasing approval, someone who has chosen to stand at the center of their own life. What happens next is something most people cannot even imagine. When you commit to this path, not casually, not occasionally, but consciously, something fundamental shifts inside you. You begin to cultivate a quiet, unshakable confidence. Not the loud confidence that needs to prove itself, not the fragile confidence that depends on praise or approval, but a grounded confidence that comes from self-trust. You stop asking the world who you should be. You stop outsourcing your worth. You stop waiting for permission. Your decisions begin to come from clarity, not confusion, from alignment, not pressure, from truth, not fear. And because of that, your relationships change, not because you try harder, but because you stop pretending. You begin to meet others as who you actually are, not through masks, roles, or adaptations designed to be accepted. And something extraordinary happens. The right people move closer. The wrong connections quietly fall away. And for the first time, intimacy becomes real because it is rooted in authenticity, not performance. Most importantly, you stop living the life others unconsciously designed for you, the life shaped by expectations, by obligation, by inherited scripts. And you begin to create the life your soul has been asking for, sometimes softly, sometimes urgently, for years. This is the difference between merely existing and truly living. Existing is survival, living is authorship. And if this message stirred even a small sense of recognition inside you, it is because part of you already knows this truth. You have always known. There is a reason this reached you now. Growth does not begin with answers. It begins with remembrance. A remembering of who you were before the world told you who to be, and from that remembering comes responsibility. Not the burdened kind, but the sacred kind. The responsibility to honor your own evolution. So let me leave you with a decision, not a demand. Choose to make yourself a priority, not out of vanity, not out of selfishness, but out of love, love for yourself, and love for the contribution that only you can bring into this world. Decide now. Act today, not dramatically, but deliberately. 15 minutes, one honest choice, one aligned action. That is how lives change. And one day, sooner than you think, your future self will look back at this moment and recognize it as the turning point. Not because everything changed instantly, but because you did. And once that happens, nothing remains the same again.